For nearly 3 decades, Melinda French Gates stood next to one of the richest and most recognizable men on the planet. She helped build a global foundation, raised 3 children, and became one of the most influential philanthropists in the world. Then, in 2021, she ended it. The divorce made headlines everywhere, and for years she said almost nothing about why. But in the spring of 2025, at 60 years old, she finally broke her silence. In a memoir, in magazine interviews, and on national television, what she revealed did not just explain a marriage. It explained a decade of quiet unraveling that most people never saw. Melinda and French was born on August 15, 1964, in Dallas, Texas, the second of 4 children. Her father worked as an engineer on the Apollo space program, and her mother managed a household with a steady, disciplined hand. It was not a wealthy childhood, but it was a purposeful one. In the late 1970s, her parents started a small side business renting out property, hoping to fund college for all 4 kids. Melinda was put to work early, painting walls, cleaning units, and eventually keeping the books. By the time she was a teenager, she understood budgets, deadlines, and the value of finishing what you started. It was around the same time that her father brought home an Apple II computer. Few households had one, and even fewer teenage girls in Texas were interested in learning the program. Melinda was an exception. She taught herself to code, using the machine to help track her family's rental records, and found something she loved in the logic of it, a system that did not care who you were, only whether your reasoning was sound. That early fascination followed her through Ursuline Academy, one of the first schools in the state to bring computers into its classrooms, and followed her to Duke University, where she earned a bachelor's degree in computer science and economics before completing an MBA in 1987, all by the age of 23. She interned twice at IBM, absorbing everything she could about how large technical teams operated. When IBM offered her a job after graduation, it looked like the safe, obvious choice. But during her final round of interviews, a hiring manager gave her advice that surprised her. Consider a smaller, scrappier company up in Seattle called Microsoft. She took the risk. In August 1987, she joined Microsoft as a product manager, one of the only women in rooms full of confident, combative engineers. Her career there moved quickly. She helped launch Cinemania, an early multimedia movie encyclopedia on CD-ROM, and then led the team behind Encarta, the digital encyclopedia that would eventually sell over 1 million copies and become a staple in homes and schools throughout the 1990s. She also worked on products that never found their footing, most notably Microsoft Bob, an ill-fated attempt to make computers friendlier through a cartoonish virtual house interface. By the early 1990s, she was a general manager overseeing more than 100 people, and by the mid-1990s, she was steering strategy behind Expedia, the travel booking service Microsoft would eventually spin off into its own publicly traded company. Away from the office, something else was developing. She and Bill Gates had begun dating in 1987, not long after she started the company, though they kept it quiet because of workplace norms at the time. They married on January 1st, 1994, on the Hawaiian island of Lanai, in a small ceremony with about 20 guests. Before the wedding, Melinda insisted on a prenuptial agreement, a decision that reflected the same independence that had defined her since childhood. 2 years later, at 32, she left Microsoft altogether to raise the couple's growing family, closing a 9-year chapter in the tech industry just as a very different one was about to begin. That new chapter with philanthropy. What started in 1994 as a modest family fund focused on health and education eventually merged in 1999 into the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, launched with an endowment of roughly $17 billion, almost entirely in Microsoft stock. Early efforts focused on getting computers and internet access into public libraries across the United States. But a trip to sub-Saharan Africa in the late 1990s changed the foundation's direction and changed Melinda personally. She saw firsthand what statistics about child mortality and preventable disease could never fully capture, and she came home convinced that global health had to sit at the center of everything the foundation did. Over the following 2 decades, the foundation poured tens of billions of dollars into vaccination campaigns, maternal health programs, and efforts to eradicate polio in countries like India and Pakistan. Melinda became especially known for championing access to contraception and family planning across Africa and Asia, work that researchers credit with preventing tens of millions of unintended pregnancies. In 2015, she also founded Pivotal Ventures, an investment company aimed specifically at advancing opportunities for women and girls in politics, technology, caregiving, and the broader economy. By any public measure, her influence had grown far beyond the shadow of her husband's name. But privately, the marriage that had made all of it possible was already under strain, and had been for years. One of the clearest turning points, by Melinda's own account, traced back to September 2013. That month, she accompanied Bill to a meeting at the Manhattan townhouse of financier Jeffrey Epstein, the same day the couple received a public service award nearby. She has since said the visit left her deeply unsettled, describing Epstein in blunt terms and saying she regretted ever walking through his door. When she later learned that Bill continued meeting with Epstein after that visit, she made her objection to the relationship unmistakably clear. It became, in her telling, one of the defining sources of tension in their marriage, a disagreement not just about one person, but about judgment, values, and what kind of life they were building together. Then came 2019, a year Melinda has since identified as the true beginning of the end. In October that year, a New York Times investigation raised pointed questions about Bill's conduct and his history with Epstein, reporting that resurfaced years-old concerns within his inner circle. Around the same period, Microsoft's board opened an investigation after a former employee alleged she had been involved in a years-long relationship with him that began while he still chaired the company. Bill later acknowledged publicly that he had not always been faithful during the marriage. For Melinda, these were not abstract headlines. They were confirmations of things she had suspected and feared for years, arriving all at once. According to her own account in her 2025 memoir, the next day, the psychological toll started showing up almost immediately in her sleep. She wrote about a recurring nightmare in which her house seemed to collapse around her, and later a second recurring image, her family standing together at the edge of a cliff while she fell over the side alone. She has said she took that second dream almost literally, as a sign that a major decision was coming, and that she would ultimately have to make it by herself. In February 2020, she invited Bill on a trip to New Mexico, framing it publicly as an ordinary vacation. On the final night of that trip, she told him she wanted to begin living separately. She has described it as one of the most frightening conversations of her life. By her account, Bill responded with sadness but also understanding, and the two spent months quietly working through what a separation would look like before she formally asked him for a divorce that summer. The public did not learn any of this until May 2021, when Bill and Melinda jointly announced that their 27-year marriage had ended, describing their relationship as no longer able to continue. The divorce became final in August of that year, with reports later estimating the settlement at somewhere in the range of $76 billion, among the largest and most closely watched divorces in modern history. Even after the papers were signed, Melinda has said the emotional aftermath did not simply end. She described experiencing panic attacks throughout the legal proceedings, driven in part by the knowledge that she was negotiating against someone widely regarded as one of the toughest deal-makers in the world. What she has been most candid about, though, is not the money or the legal process, but the underlying reason she says the marriage could no longer continue. Speaking with Stephen Colbert in April 2025, while promoting her memoir, she put it in the simplest terms she could. A trusted marriage, she said, requires both partners to be honest with each other. And without that honesty, there is no real intimacy and no real trust. In the end, she said that was why she had to go. She has repeated versions of that same idea in other interviews since, framing the divorce less as a single dramatic event and more as the natural conclusion of years spent trying and ultimately failing to reconcile her personal values with the reality of her marriage. She has also spoken about how she managed to hold on to her own sense of self while all of this was happening in public. In her book, she wrote about feeling her own inner voice grow quieter in the decade before the marriage ended, gradually subordinated to the demands of the foundation, the family, and her husband's public image. Years of therapy, she has said, helped her learn how to respond to betrayals in her marriage without betraying her own values in the process, a phrase she returns to often when discussing what the experience taught her. Notably, Melinda has drawn a clear line around how much she is willing to say. In interviews tied to the memoir, she has declined to lay out every specific reason behind the divorce in detail, arguing that some of that story belongs to Bill to tell, not her. What she's been willing to share are the patterns, the years of quietly absorbing disappointment, the moment the dam broke, and the slow process of rebuilding a version of herself that existed independently of the marriage that had defined so much of her adult life. The years since the divorce have looked less like retreat and more like reinvention. In May 2024, Melinda formally stepped down from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation after roughly a quarter-century of shared leadership, leaving Bill as sole chair. She pledged at least $1 billion over following 2 years toward causes focused on women and girls, funneled largely through pivotal ventures, which by 2025 had already backed more than 150 organizations working on issues ranging from caregiving policy to women's political representation. She has spoken about preferring a simpler life now, walking to the drugstore, choosing a neighborhood over a mansion, and about being in a new relationship she has described, without going into detail, as going pretty great. What makes Melinda Gates' account striking is not any single revelation, but the way she has connected them into a single through line, a marriage that looked from the outside like one of the most stable and successful partnerships in the world, sustained for years by a private erosion of honesty that she alone could feel happening. The Epstein connection, the 2019 investigation, the nightmares, the New Mexico conversation, the panic attacks during the settlement, each piece she has chosen to share adds up to the same conclusion she has stated plainly and repeatedly. Trust and honesty were the foundation her marriage needed. And once those cracked, no amount of shared history, shared children, or shared wealth could hold the rest together. At 61, Melinda French Gates is no longer defined primarily by the man she was once married to. She is a billionaire in her own right, a major force in global philanthropy, an author, and by her own description, a woman who spent over a decade learning how to stay true to herself while everything around her was in motion. Her story, as she now tells it, is not really about a divorce at all. It is about what it costs to keep quiet for too long, and what it takes to finally decide that honesty, even when it is expensive, is worth more than staying.